And we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know exactly when that will occur, but for every one of us running a club or working with swimmers currently out of the water, how do we prepare them for that return to the water? So we're going to be working on a document which we hope to release early next week around that particular topic. Then a second one will really be dealing with if we are able to get back in the water before, let's say we would traditionally return for the new season, and let's say for the sake of argument, the 2nd to 3rd week of September. If we get it back in the water before then, what type of work would we be doing in conjunction with some dry land? And would we still want to take a bit of a break over the Labor Day weekend, etc.? And so we're going to provide some guidelines, no matter who you're actually dealing with, the swimmers, around that aspect. And then a third document where we're really going to look at what does that first sort of macro cycle, when we get back into the normal timetable, from sort of mid-September through to mid-December, what does that look like? And the reason for that is we have to be fairly careful really in what we're doing with our swimmers, given both the physical and the psychological challenges that they've had over the last few weeks. And then the final one would be, already Kevin Dennis has done some exceptional work for us in sort of formulating some ideas around what a return to competition might look like, particularly given the constraints that we're going to be under in that same time period. So look ahead to those documents. We're going to use those to help you guide and shape your ideas. And tonight really is a kickoff as we start to look at, as I said, to trying to give you some guidelines as to how you can help with not only your swimmers, but yourself, your coaching staff, your parents, and indeed any of your other volunteers that are working with you. As we deal with the next few weeks and then on into the next few months. So I'm going to shut up now and I'm going to hand it over to Frank. Frank is a colleague of mine over many years now. We've worked over several Olympic cycles, largely on my side from the winter side, but Frank has worked extensively with summer sports as well. He's also one of our integral experts that's worked with Team Alberta for Canada Games, summer and winter. He's worked with our swimmers in particular, and particularly last summer at the Summer Games, and he's well voiced in this. He's well respected. He has a leadership role within the mental performance consultants nationally, and he brings to the table a wealth of experience. And as I said, I've worked with him extensively over several Olympic cycles on the winter sports side. So I'm going to hand it over to Frank. You're in good hands, and take it away, Frank. It's all yours.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this first webinar. Hope you come with great interest. I'm sure that I can provide you with some really valuable information, tips and strategies that will possibly benefit yourself and the people that you work with. And I encourage you to take notes and to kind of pass on the message to people that are not on these webinars at this point. And it's with great pleasure that Steve has asked me to kind of think about something like this. We got reconnected 4 or 5 weeks ago, and we had a bit of a chat about where we are in our work and what was happening. And through that conversation, it became very clear that we could put our minds together and provide something really good for your sport and for Swim Alberta and who's involved with that. So as Steve alluded, we've been preparing for 3 consecutive sessions over the next 3 weeks, starting today with really looking at the pandemic and what kind of responses that generates. I'd like to tie in the importance of well-being, mental health, and how that can be affected through this situation, and what we can do to engage in some what we now call psychological hygiene, and I'll come back to that. There's just too much to cover. that therefore we've decided to make a series of 3. You can see the other topics. There is a lot of rich information in there, and a lot of this information is actually very, very current, as this comes out also on the national team level, with basically the whole mental performance community aligned and collaborating towards supporting the sports and the teams and the athletes and coaches we work with. I'd like to make this point. You are a leader, you are a coach, and therefore you are a role model within your club, within your team, for the people that you work with. So I think, as Steve said, a lot of this information will actually pertain very, very much to yourself, but you can use this, this opportunity to really show other people around when it comes to some of these topics that we're gonna talk about. A few more words about myself. Yes, I've been in this work of mental performance for over 22 years. I've been a sports psychologist since '98 in the Netherlands, which was my former home country. And in 2005, I moved over to Calgary in Canada and became a Canadian eventually. And I'm now a mental performance consultant and lead mental performance at the Canadian Sport Institute Calgary. In my work, I work with national team level athletes and next gen level athletes in the sports of alpine and luge and wrestling and paracycling and a little bit of ski jumping. It's kind of heavily winter sport oriented through the institute in Calgary. But yes, I've also have rich experience with working with Team Alberta provincial level athletes through 3 Canada Games, and that has been my joy to be working with really developmental level athletes and help them grow in their path. I put this slide up just to give you a quick overview about some of the skill sets and type of work that I do throughout the sport with many different teams. And some of it may look familiar. But on the bottom there, you find crisis intervention and psychological first aid. And unfortunately, in my career and in my work, I've been working through various crises in sport with some of my colleagues since 2010, actually since the fatal accident on the Whistler track at the Olympics there, and then these crises tend to happen every so often. This has been a particularly bad year where 3 next-gen athletes have kind of passed away or have been injured very, very seriously in their sport, and therefore we have these protocols in place to kind of attend to the needs of staff and athletes and coaches in the aftermath of such a crisis. But it became very obvious at some point that the current crisis that we're in is not one of those singular crises that happens on a particular day and has an aftermath of several days, weeks, and this pandemic is obviously ongoing and long term. And so very early on, like basically on March 11, when the pandemic was declared and the NBA shut down, me and my colleagues across the country realized that we needed to start attending to kind of the needs of athletes throughout the country, and that a lot of the sports would be looking at us about how can you help us, what should we do, and how can we work through this. So we came together in a task force, a mental health and mental performance task force, and we're doing a lot of work over the last three months to help all the programs out. And so what I'm doing today and also in the next couple of sessions is very current material. It's built upon our normal work of mental training, mental performance, resilience building, that type of thing. But this whole situation has accelerated us in thinking about what we can do next. So just to give you a bit of context there. So to start off with, I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about I did not know about pandemics and what that meant, and as I said, we were kind of used to work through singular type of crisis events or incidents in sport, and this was very different. So we started to look towards some lessons from other areas like psychology of disaster, and something that we're not familiar with. But there is a body of work that we have been using to our advantage to kind of really help understand what happens in times of disaster and how people respond and what we may want to attend to. And so I'd like to share some of that with you because I think it provides a really good context from where we can move forward positively, as the title of this webinar series is called. So before I go into some of common phases that we tend to go through, these are some observations that I think are worth mentioning. No one who sees a disaster is untouched by it, and that includes yourself as well. Obviously, everyone has their own experience, their own challenge, their own hardship. But usually these types of disastrous events have profound effects on many people in many different ways. And what I also want to stress is that there can be this distinction between how we respond to these types of events individually and how there can be lots of variation in those experiences. But there can also be some more collective type experiences and features that we want to recognize because it helps us to work through. Through all of this, we've also found that, also through research, that most people are actually able to work together and function well, or relatively well, I should say. But because of certain circumstances that you will find out shortly, their effectiveness may be not as great, or their motivation may not be as great, or their energy may not be as great. Excuse me. And then the other point to remember is, yes, the disaster itself, and obviously this comes from disasters like tornadoes and earthquakes and flooding and that type of disaster, and not necessarily about a pandemic, because that hasn't happened for a while, so we don't know too much about this. I'm sure we're getting very much wiser through the process today. But many emotional reactions from disaster survivors come from the disruptions in their daily life that is kind of the hardest to work with. And when you think about how the necessities of life, like housing, transportation, work, and how we can connect, or currently maybe not so much. So that's just a few points to make at the beginning. And then I'd like to kind of show you a little bit of a graph here. And obviously it's a very generic type of model here, but it really points to various phases that we may find ourselves working through or in our experience. And something like this is really, really helpful to look at those psychosocial phases, to really understand it well, to have some acceptance in the situation. Yeah, it's understandable that we're finding ourselves here, that we can that we can be compassionate to ourselves and others within this particular circumstances. And also we can actually specify various needs that we may attend to effectively cope and overcome these challenges. Now, it has to be said that obviously it depends on the type of disaster. Is it a natural one? Is it human caused? What's the size? What's the scope of something, of the disaster that we're talking about? Now, in this case, it's a natural disaster, and the size and scope is massive. It also depends, what the degree of personal impact is as we relate to these different phases or characteristics of what we find. And there's also something to say about the probability of recurrence, like, because we're working through a disaster, but is it possible that something like this will happen again at some point? Now, as it usually is with these types of models, the intensity and duration of these phases, they may vary. It may be shorter, it may be longer, and they may also overlap. It doesn't have to be linear necessarily. And obviously, as I said before, people and subgroups may experience these things at different times as well. So before I go into some more detail around what happens after the impact of disaster, obviously there is something that is called pre-disaster, and that you can see there is the warning or the threat. And I can recall, March 11th, this pandemic was declared, but we already knew that there was a problem brewing in other parts of the world and on cruise ships. And people traveling in and out places, and obviously bringing coronavirus back into our midst. So we already knew that something was happening before everything went into lockdown, and we went into the major effect of it. Depending on the disaster, the impact is obviously different, can be characterized by a range of different emotional reactions. Usually in the beginning, there's a lot of confusion, even disbelief, like maybe ignorance, like, yeah, this is not a big deal, or I don't care. And there's often a focus also on self-preservation and family protection, which are obviously very natural mechanisms. The impact phase is usually the shortest here, before we go into the next ones, kind of thing. Before I turn the slide here, I'd like to point out a few more details that you find further up in the graph, which are trigger events and sometimes setbacks. And obviously, as we're trying to mitigate this whole problem as good as we can, and kind of open up in smart ways and get back to, I don't know, I should say the normal life. No, it's not going to be normal. It's going to be a next type of reality, a new type of reality. But we are within our own task force already preparing for those trigger events and setbacks that we expect to happen. Maybe not everywhere, and maybe not in the whole country, but maybe more localized in various provinces or in particular places. And so I think it's really important to take a look at that in advance. So the rescue or heroic phase, is usually characterized by a high level of activity. In the immediate aftermath, survival and safety is usually prioritized in attending to the immediate needs that people have. There's a great deal of energy and activity into those types of activities, like rescuing, assisting, housing, emergency repair, and cleanup. And this is usually fairly short-lived. This happens days or weeks, obviously, again, depending on the kind of the magnitude of what we're talking about in this disaster. In this phase, there is a sense of altruism, and many community members exhibit some higher levels of adrenaline and kind of energy to mobilize themselves. But very, very, very quickly, this goes over into the next phase, which is kind of the honeymoon part of it. The picture that you see is just happens to be an athlete that I'm following, that I've worked with in the past. That she's a synchronized swimmer, or an artistic swimmer, I should say. And this is a great example about what happens in the sport context. National team athletes, they are reaching out to their team. They're reaching out to other members in their sport to help them through particular challenges. So, she, like many others, started to do this kind of, exercise routine on Zoom or whatever medium it was, and, doing it in different and creative ways, basically to provide some initial motivation and energy. Now, the next phase that we go into is what we call honeymoon, and this is where we are starting to get a little bit of a sense about what's going on. We're starting to maybe relax a little bit in the kind of the disbelief, or in the surprise, or in the new reality that we're facing. Usually, this is a little bit more characterized by optimism in the community or in individuals. We see, community members bonding, that occurs as a result of sharing the experience and kind of giving and also receiving support to one another. So there's a lot of cohesion and bonding type things happening. What is interesting is that in this particular phase, also the additional or external support becomes more visible. In disaster relief work, it's about those mental health workers that are becoming more visible. In our world of sport, it becomes the mental performance consultant that are now coming to the forefront and starting to help athletes and coaches out to kind of with those initial coping strategies or what they want to do and how to manage the situation. Towards the end of the honeymoon, people start to see that it actually may become a little difficult to rebuild, and that it may take a little bit of a longer time. and energy begins to be depleted. So, you know, fatigue sets in, or boredom sets in. And you know what you're seeing here on the slide is exactly the same thing as, you know, community cohesion and bonding. People start to do training sessions together over Zoom, and that's a great example about how you connect together and still, even in confinement and isolation, do something worthwhile together. So after the honeymoon, we may actually start sliding off a little bit in what we call disillusionment. And it's a stark contrast with what went on before, with kind of the high energy and kind of the initial bonding and sharing of experience. Fatigue sets in. It takes longer. There may be, you know, those cumbersome procedures that we're now all familiar with that we have to work through. There may be some limits in what can be done. So often the politics play up. And you know, the symptoms related to stress, they start to intensify in this period. You know, hope decreases, motivation drops often, energy drops. So you can kind of expect some of those things to see happening. I haven't mentioned other, you know, experiences like fatigue, frustration, impatience. I've seen that a lot with the people that I work. Like, when can we get back, or what can we do? And the boredom that comes with a completely different type of lifestyle, and also obviously decreased motivation. Like, what am I doing, and what am I doing it for? And at this time, mental health becomes a little bit of a concern, or can become a concern, and must be regular. You know, must be monitored, and you know, various activities may be undertaken to actually mitigate kind of the occurrence of some of those mental health concerns. Now, and you know, this picture, you know, it's still on the CBC website. You know, how COVID-19 shuts down the sports world. So you know, they keep reiterating and reverberating all these kind of negative events, and it's hard to read through to find some optimism. So therefore, you know, Team Canada, the Canadian Olympic Committee, they start these campaigns. They start, okay, we as athletes, we are citizens. We are changing our role. We are not the high performance athlete at the moment. We need to step down, and we need to take care of ourselves, and we need to take care of each other. And let's do this together. So that's where you can see that the powerful campaign like this kind of unfolds. Now, after disillusionment, obviously, you know, we'd like to at some point kind of start working towards recovery and reconstruction, and obviously that is going to happen. But I think we all kind of, you know, understand that this is going to be a very slow process. This is going to happen in steps. There's going to be lots of different procedures and new realities attached to the recovery process. So we don't even exactly know how this is going to look. And this may take a long time before this kind of recovery or reconstruction is in its way. So what is interesting is the second point here is that, you know, we want to be proactive, we want to be responsible, we want to be optimistic and productive. So we are readjusting to these new realities as they come along, and we start to integrate them in our new training environment and in our surroundings. But at the same time, we have to realize that some of those losses can still be grieved. And when I talk about losses, it can be simply be like, I miss my friends, I miss swimming, I've missed time, I'm losing out on all kinds of things. So that is not necessarily, you know, coming back at, you know, at the same time. But there's also more optimistic things like the repair and mitigation initiated early on becomes more apparent and starts to impacting personal growth, and people start to see meaning. Okay, I can actually have a different perspective on this, and I can see some things as an opportunity to do things different. And I've been starting to hear that a lot more kind of recently. And you know, it is definitely, in my experience at least, that this connectedness or even relationships with my coworkers or with people that I work with is changing, is different, and is not necessarily changing for the worse. We we even get to know each other in a slightly different ways. You know, in our town halls, we learn, in our virtual town halls nowadays, we learn different things from people that they're now sharing as part of their story, you know, working through confinement, that I even didn't know about before while I was working with these people for years. So that's kind of interesting to see as a result. Now, to cap this piece off, again, I'd like to emphasize that these phases, this model is a general model, is a general trend. Obviously, it can be a little different up and down, and it can also be non-linear. You don't have to go from one to the next. You can actually fall back into the previous one if new realities become apparent. But each phase is important to kind of see what's going on and how we can be aware of things, how we can accept it as our reality and work with that. And that means that we take care of ourselves in that new reality, and that we can also have understanding, empathy, and compassion for others and ourselves. Obviously, there's individual differences that we need to be mindful of, and it's really important that throughout this whole process, we need to maintain this level of social connection and hope and optimism, and work with a growth mindset that will aid in our recovery and building resilience. And that's something that we're going to explore much more next week. So yeah, if you have any questions, you want to come back to it, please put it in the chat, and we'll address it after my my presentation here. Not too long. It's important to realize that, and I've said it already, that people respond differently to these types of crisis or disasters or stress. We can say that most people are very resilient. They are very resilient together. They take good care of themselves and each other, and they don't necessarily develop long-term mental health concerns. But there can be, you know, people that fall through the cracks, or maybe a group that is affected a little bit more based on their personal circumstances. And so you can see that a large percentage is kind of, yeah, they're affected, but it's not a big deal, not a big impact. There's a smaller group that actually have some impact. 15 to 20% is maybe realistic to think of, and there's going to be a smaller group that we need to look much more closer at. And I'm going to go into that right now. So after the coronavirus, a pandemic has been declared very quickly. About a week later, they basically were declaring that, I'm talking about the WHO, they were declaring an information pandemic because so much information was broadcasted about this everywhere all the time. So they were warning against the effects of the information pandemic. And a little later, maybe a few weeks later, they started to talk about what they call the echo pandemic. And this is the expected significant rise in mental health issues in those that are affected by COVID-19 and the circumstances that are surrounding that. And we've seen that end of April, CBC came out with a news item that half of Canadians say mental health has worsened during this time. And it's not surprising that you'll find these types of responses. It's just important to acknowledge that this is happening, and that you know, 1 in every 5 of us, or 1 in every 6, or 1 in every 4 of us, we can definitely see some big impact. And this is another graph that was presented in the same news article on CBC. So you can just see that there's people that are doing well, there's people that are not doing well, and that's kind of the point that I want to make. If you would want to work a little bit better in mitigating some of those concerns for yourself through self-help and some exercises, and I'll put this in the chat box afterwards. There are a few handouts that are really helpful. One is on managing anxiety, one is on kind of relaxation and breathing, one is on a healthy habit log type thing. So there are some things that you can work through, or that people that you work with can work through, that can maybe alleviate some of the concerns. So I will actually share that with you. Yeah, stress. So, you know, again, there's differentiation among people, but we have to acknowledge that a large group of our population is affected by stress. And this is for very different reasons. People need to figure out how they work from home while they're having a family. Teachers have to figure out how they are doing their lessons virtually. People may be laid off or have a loss of income. People are in different lifestyle circumstances. They are now living 24 hours together, where before people were kind of going to work and coming back. They had a different routine. They were going to hockey, all of those things. So it's just important to acknowledge that this can be real concerns, and that they can have effects, and those effects, those symptoms are probably well understood, I hope, with many of you. But it's really important to look at what stress can do to a person or a human being. Signs and symptoms that are coming from the mind for how we think and how we kind of get into a negative spiral. Signs and symptoms that are really manifested in the body, and that we find annoying or painful. Emotions that we're feeling and living through, or even different types of behavior that we'd like to be mindful of. So it's really important, with a level of awareness about how is this affecting us, or how is this affecting people around you. And when I'm coming to kind of the psychological hygiene, and when I'm talking about emotions, for example, I would say then talk about these things, bring these signs and symptoms up, and make them part of a conversation, because they are important for people to understand and have some awareness around. And then there can be obviously different things that help them, limit those signs and symptoms. So this is where I'm coming into the last part of this presentation, and we can have a bit of a discussion. So we started to think about terms of psychological hygiene. I'm not talking about the sanitation and hand washing and the other type of personal hygiene that we typically think of. We wanted to provide the message that we need to take care of ourselves in a psychological way, and therefore activate hygiene or psychological hygiene for ourselves. And we're just going to give you a few examples from each of these areas, what you can attend to. And this is, again, the very same current information that we're pushing out everywhere in sport about how people can actually take care of themselves and each other. So the emotional tolerance bit. Yes, we can maybe see it as an emotional roller coaster that we're going through, in the first few days or even first few weeks of our lockdown, what we went through at that time, and how we moved on from there, and how we're starting to, do grocery shopping differently, or how we need to connect with people differently. And it leads to all these different feelings and emotions. And we must remember that emotions are an integral part of all human experiences. They are here to help us relate to other people, to recognize what we want and how we make choices. We should accept that our emotions are real and valid, and they are real and valid responses to this very abnormal event. So we need to kind of look at it from through a very lens of normalizing this type of experiencing. And by understanding our emotions and core needs, we are able to increase our emotional tolerance. And in short, it's okay to feel emotional. So name those emotions that we are experiencing. For example, I feel guilty that I'm yelling at my partner today. And also recognizing that it is valid. I'm experiencing this guilt for a reason. This is how I'm feeling, and I should accept this emotion as a normal aspect of my experience. It's understandable that I feel guilty since I really care about this person. So this is how you can start talking about emotions and naming them, and having a conversation about this. And this becomes an important part when we return to training. We're going to cover this a little bit in 2 weeks from now, but how we actually talk about our experiences and and how we feel about things. So the next piece is really about stress management. On the left side, you see just a number of things that you're familiar with by now that are protective. The physical distancing, the hand washing, the whole mask thing, staying home when you're sick. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but yeah, that's what we need to be doing now. But also things like we want to reduce the information that we take in, because it can be too much, too overwhelming, too negative, and we may start worrying about it, or we may not even sleep well about it. And also, when you're actually exposed to some negative information that concerns you, I encourage you to switch the page and go to something that's much lighter. You know, watch some kind of a comedy, something that is more lighthearted. Play a game. You know, have a different mood through a different activity. This is really important and protective. And on the stress management side, you can obviously look at those things like, what are those stressors? What is stressing me out? And, you know, write them down, name them, because that helps us understand and target those very specific stressors. It's always good to connect with others and express those worries, because that's how we feel supported, and that's how we support each other. So again, to engage in that conversation. Exercising, eating and sleeping well, limiting our alcohol intake, and then the other ones like spending time outdoors to benefit from Mother Nature's healing effects, which is really, really important. I encourage you to do breathing exercises, relaxation exercises. Actually, the same link that I'm going to share with you also has a link to a couple of audio clips that you can use. And having fun and try new things that you may not have been doing before, because you've never been in this situation. So why wouldn't you actually take up something else? Mindfulness is a deep awareness of the present moment. Is being about right here, right now, with an accepting and non-judgmental attitude. So that means that you're just noticing what's happening, noticing what you're thinking, noticing what you're feeling, noticing what the sensations are in your body. And it sounds funny to be not doing anything about it, but just noticing it and just trying to be okay with it without necessarily saying it's good or bad. You're just becoming more you're just becoming likely less stressed about it. Try the mindfulness app, Calm, for free for 1 month. See how this type of work can work for you. And a daily dose of mindfulness training can make a world of difference. I know that from my own practice, and I know that from my practice with my clients as well. And finally, I'd like to just pay attention to this one more minute to help balance stress. For example, the whole fight and flight response when we feel threatened, we may want to focus on the good things that are happening, maybe even on a daily basis. And we can do this by scanning the world around us and finding at least a few positive things, 3 positive things for which you are grateful. You know, whatever you did today and that, you know, you are content with, that you're happy with, that you're good with. Finding those elements of gratitude is really, really important, and you know, keeping check of your of the things that you're grateful for makes you feel better when you're actually engaging with it. And when you're lacking a little bit of hope or confidence or motivation, you can actually go back to that list of gratefulness to actually rejuvenate yourself and refocus. And then when it comes to growth, you can also mitigate stress by adopting a much more challenger approach, mindset, and looking for opportunities for growth and learning that comes with a challenge that we're facing. Rather than seeing it as a pure threat or a problem, how can we actually look at it through a different lens and see how we can get better through this? This is a very, very powerful story or message that I'm sharing with people that I work with, is that they always look for how they can work through this to resolve it, or how can they actually become better in the process of doing this. So, you know, in sport, and I've seen this a lot, the quarantine period has been a great opportunity to build mental fitness and resiliency skills, which can help also in sport performance once everyone goes back to sport. So with this, I would like you to really think about taking a proactive and preventative approach and practice this psychological hygiene on a daily basis. Maybe for yourself, but maybe with others that you're working with in your clubs or in your community. So thank you for your patience and for your attention here. I know it was a lot of information, but we have about 50 minutes to kind of go through a number of questions or discussion. Just feel free to chime in. You wanna take it from here, Steve?
Yes, I will. So what I would do, what I suggest is that you print your question in the chat box, and then I'll sort of modulate the discussion. As you know, we wanted to keep it very succinct, each of these 1-hour sessions. Even if we don't cover all the questions, we're going to, if that's another reason for you to put them into the chat box. The sessions are recorded as a resource for the community, so don't think you're losing out, because as you've seen, Frank has put a lot of thought into being able to present the core elements of information that he feels that would be of interest for us. And so we didn't want to lose those. So we have all that. But if you want to start, and if you do have any questions, please put them into the box and we'll start to go through them. Okay. And as you can see, Frank's just given you a link in the chat box around some COVID-19 printable handouts. So Frank, I'll start the ball rolling for you. So given this first sort of sequence of information and knowing, you know, what you're going to be presenting on next, what really would you like to emphasize to us from this sort of first session with us as to things we can really think about and start to act on? I mean, obviously there are a number of sound bites, but from your perspective, what would you like to steer us towards?
Well, this is a really good question to set the stage here, because I'm going to argue that everything that I've been presenting on kind of the mental health and the psychological hygiene and how you take care of yourself is important anyway for well-being and also for performance. So to be paying attention to those aspects and actually practicing would be always a good thing. But you know, the stage is different right now. The circumstances and the pandemic that we're finding ourselves in forces us to look at these things much more with much greater priority, or with much greater emphasis, so to speak, to stay well, to do the right things, so we can actually, you know, once we get back to training, we can actually focus on those sport aspects again. For now, under these circumstances, you know, and this is part of today's focus, is basically to take care of ourselves first before we start thinking about how we can eventually get back into sport.
Yes, I think, you know, that's a great point. You know, in the same way with the dry land aspect, has forced us as swimmers and swim coaches to really look at what we've been doing in the past and re-examine things. And I would actually say, you know, we had identified our dry land education and practices as a cause of concern here in Alberta anyway. And I think it's really forced our coaches to re-examine what we're doing. You know, we've tended to sort of hang on to what we do. We just take dry land from other sports and just sort of put it into a swimming context, rather than look at what we really need for particularly the various age groups, the genders, but swimming specificity. And so exactly the same as you're talking about, this area of, you know, mental performance, resiliency, a firm basis for moving forward, dealing with competition, etc. We tend to pay a lip service to us. So it's an opportunity for us to really get to the root issues, don't you think?
Yes, very, very, very much so. And it has actually been the reality with many of my colleagues that would attest to this as well, is that many sports have actually used it to their advantage to actually start doing things, because now they have the time, and now it can be programmed with a priority, because, well, other things are falling by the wayside a little bit. You know, it's not a good thing that they're falling by the wayside, but you can still do something very useful and valuable at the same time. And just building on that, and you kind of, it's interesting because, you know, we gravitate to, you know, let's talk more about that resiliency building, and let's talk more about how we can back into the training environment. That gives us all kinds of opportunities. We are using now words like transformation. Can you actually do things differently to be better in the end? And so, you know, rather than, you know, I think you used the same terminology, like doing what we've always done. Now we are having a hard look at it, and we can start being creative and start figuring things out about how we can do things differently. And so, otherwise, you would never have that pause, that kind of time to reflect on it and to make it work. And I would argue, when it comes to our own well-being and mental health and how we go through a crisis, a disaster, and pandemic like this, we want to pay attention to our own welfare in the first place. And that is something that was a strong message to the high performance athletes as well. Like, listen, forget about sport, forget about your peak performance. That's not going to happen. You're not going to train for peak performance. You're going to train to maintain fitness. And therefore, you're, for a little while, your identity is a bit different because it's not that high performer. You're just a normal citizen, but that gives you also opportunities to work in other areas.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, we've had two questions come in, and they're very, from reading through them, very core questions. So the first one comes in: understanding that the swimmers are emotional roller coasters right now, we can help them in identifying their emotional states and helping them sort them through them. How do you suggest we help them change their viewpoints and handling of their emotions, and then how can we sustain it?
Well, there's two things that are really important at the beginning of this when you're intending to help young athletes to work through this. And that's, first of all, to actually create an environment in which that conversation can take place, in which where there is a safety, a psychological safety, a relationship in which athletes and coaches, for example, can share some of these sometimes personal type of experiences without having the fear of any kind of judgment or repercussion of some sort. Because it's, as I try to make a point, it's really important to identify what those emotions are. So you need to get to a place where you can actually share that. And often we find ourselves wanting to jump to a conclusion or to a solution right away when you hear something. I want to fix this for you. But very often in this type of work, it's really important to build the awareness around, like, how do you feel today and what does it mean to you? And that may be similar or different the next day. So you can gain a better understanding about what those experiences are, and to be okay with it. It's not necessarily desirable, or it's not necessarily enjoyable, but they can still be part of our experience. And once you have that type of conversation or understanding, then you can start thinking about, okay, is there a different way we can look at it? I brought up the growth mindset, but that's basically, looking at a challenge or a threat or a mistake or a bad experience, and say, okay, but can we take this through can we look at this from a different angle? Can we look at it through a different lens, so we can understand it? Maybe we can think about it also in a different way. And so having that language, having that patience, having that empathy, and you will hear that in 2 weeks when we're talking about the psychosocial aspects for returning to training, that I will advocate for empathy in the beginning. Because, you're going to go back swimming, but let's get together first. And then that's where the connection is being built. So I think this whole emotional processing and sharing, and then making sure that people are relatively okay and what they're going to engage in, or how you engage with them, is really, really important.
Thank you. The next question then: any practical advice for beginning to work on psychological hygiene for athletes? Where would be a good place to start with kids? And remember, we're dealing with some very young age groups, from 8 through to, say, 12, 13 years of age, as well as on into our sort of mid to late teens.
Yeah, so think about body, mind, emotion, feeling, and behavior, and start having conversations, or even playful conversations, or maybe some role play, or maybe some play, actually, not role play, play, where these experiences can be acknowledged. So when you're doing an activity that's really exciting, high level, like high energy, lots of excitement, so to speak, that generates typically a different type of experience that when you're really tired or when you're really mad. And so having conversations to sensitize young athletes or young people to be, getting to understand what emotions are and what they're like, and how the body, mind, feelings, and behavior kind of come together. That's a good starting point. You can do various relaxation exercises that are very very friendly for young children. This is something I'm going to share next week. I prepared it for next week, and I call it mental fitness for long-term athlete development. And it's basically giving very, very strategic tips and activities for what you can do in all these levels at different age groups. So if that person would want to kind of stick around for next week, I'll have much more information on that.
Okay, that's a very good point, actually, because our next question, which came in from Rianne, was more to do with this. I mean, obviously, there's a concern at times, and that much of this is often to do with not only sort of more mature and adults, but also to the sort of elite level of athlete. And so obviously for us dealing with predominantly youngsters, age group swimmers, rapidly developing both physically and emotionally charged young humans. And the question says, there's an element of maturity and regular adolescent development in the reactions and emotions the swimmers are experiencing. In addition, they have a home from a world where their life has been very scripted between school and swimming. And how does this change and approach that is primarily for adults, or I assume that's actually elite athletes? I think obviously next week would really start to address that. But I just wondered if you could just, you've identified that clearly there are differences between the age groups that coaches need to be aware of without just sort of pigeonholing kids. They've got to pay attention to each individual kid or each individual swimmer. But clearly there's a sort of developmental process of not only understanding, but how kids are coping. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I do agree that, I personally may be a little bit more biased towards kind of the older athletes and kind of the high performing athletes. And I do realize throughout my work also with developmental athletes, that it's really important to obviously change your approach and change your language and change the way you facilitate these things. Also time wise, you don't want to do, too much or too long or too often. But regularity is probably very important. So I don't think that it's wise to be trying to, in my previous example, have something to do around feelings or signs and symptoms in the body or what you're thinking about only once, because that's going to be very, very, very fluid. It's going to be gone very quickly. But if you make a habit of having these kind of 5-minute chats before a session or before you get in, or do different things kind of repetitively, athletes may start to see that there is actually a learning effect taking place. And so, yeah, language does become very, very important. And it's really important to adapt to that. And I'm sure that a lot of you as coaches are much more used to, to be facilitating that with some of these young kids than others. And yeah, I do agree that there's differences between, let's say, 8 to 12-year-olds, 14 to 16-year-olds, and then those young maturers, and then kind of the older population. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I think to be attentive to those differences is important.
Yes, no, and I know that when we've discussed the material for the next couple of weeks, that we're going to touch on this in more depth.
Yeah.
And so one of the things I think, just to wrap up for everyone, is first off, thank you so much, Frank. You've given us a lot of information. We wanted to keep these sessions, if you like, very succinct and on point, and build a little bit of a resource for everyone. If people do have questions, you can email through to myself between now and next week, and Frank and I will sort of catalog the questions. We've kept a record of the information and the questions in the chat box. So anything that we feel that we need to re-emphasize or touch upon, we will do in subsequent sessions for you. These sessions are for you, our community. And so we want to make sure that you recognize that we're here as a resource, if you like, no different than, say, having a set of books on a shelf that you can actually just grab hold of. But we rely very heavily then on the interaction with you to come back at us to ask questions. And the beauty about it is, for Frank and I, we have lots of resources. So if we can't answer the question directly, we know typically where or who we can go and talk to be able to provide you with some examples to help you through. And the key thing is, we are all learning in through this. This is almost a living laboratory. That's not an excuse, but it's a way for us to make sure that we are all here to solve any issues, to come up with solutions to any of the challenges that you face, from large clubs to small clubs to rural to urban to senior national qualifiers to kids taking their first dive into the competitive pool. And so please rely upon us from that. And as I said, we want to keep a respect for everyone's time, and we'd rather pack a lot into these 60 minutes than just drag things on. So with that note, I'd like to bring to a close our first meeting. We look forward to next week. As I said, I'd like you to do a little bit of homework to start to think about what you're doing right now, and how would you start to think about approaching a return to training. As I said, myself and the technical staff, Jackie and Kevin will be working on a little bit of a handout for you that we will be sending out through our normal avenues, and obviously with the support of the rest of our Swim Alberta staff and our ED Cheryl, we want to be able to provide a very sensible resource body for you for the next little while. So thank you very much, and thank you very much, Frank. I don't know if you just want to wrap up with a final comment for us.
Yeah, no, it was a pleasure doing this. I know it's quite a bit of information. I know it's also maybe hard to think about, oh, this is, you know, we have to do all kinds of things about this. I think it's more important that you have a great awareness about some of these processes, some of the effects that it has on people. If you have the awareness, you can actually be more attentive. You probably can reach out a bit more, and that's, I think, the first goal. So even if you don't know exactly what to do next, being more aware about how we do through these situations already is very, very helpful.
Super. Well, thanks very much, Frank. I'll Skype you in a few minutes just to do a quick debrief for you and me, if that's
Sounds
okay.
good.
But
Yeah.
everyone else, thank you very much. Have a great evening. And as I said, reach out to us over the next 7 days, and we look forward to speaking with you next week. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good